My name is Antonio Reed, and welcome to the Temple Podcast. In this episode of the Temple Podcast, I sit down with Andrew of Unitarian Apologetics, and we talk about Philippians 2:6, whether or not Jesus pre existed his human flesh, his human birth, and whether or not he is, in fact, divine from this pre existent state. Now, this is a very provocative, very informative, and very engaging conversation, so please join me in talking with Andrew about Philippians 2:6, whether or not Jesus was pre-existent according to Paul in his letter to the church in Philippi.
Before we get started, I wanted to look at this really quick for everybody watching. This is just a quick excerpt from a book called Hermeneutics, Principles and Processes of Biblical Interpretation by Henry Virkler. Okay. Now, he says this about hermeneutics I thought was really interesting. He says that because a lot of times we hear this word hermeneutics, and it seems like such a lofty word, like as if we have to have necessarily some sort of degree in order to understand scriptures. And this is not necessarily correct. But he says here just some basic definitions about this word hermeneutics. He says the word hermeneutics is said to have its origin in the name Hermes, the Greek god who served as a messenger for the gods, transmitting and interpreting their communications to their fortunate or often unfortunate recipients. And so we have here that when we have these divine texts, so applying this to the Bible, we have this divine text, and sometimes it's in need of those who are going to go in and interpret the scriptures. It says that in its technical meaning, hermeneutics is often defined as the science and art of biblical interpretation. To be a good interpreter, one must learn the rules of hermeneutics as well as the art of applying those rules. And he goes on and says that one of the reasons is because there's often a gap in between these cultures and our cultures. And so he goes on to say hermeneutics is needed then because of the historical, cultural, linguistic, and philosophical gaps that block a spontaneous, accurate understanding of God's word. And so we see here as well more of a basic rule that we can use, a guideline we can use for hermeneutics when we're looking at all the different various contextual elements of any given text. So we have the internal context of the Bible itself. We have, for instance, the internal context, we would have the target text itself. So if we're looking at Philippians 2:6-11, this would be probably our target text, could even narrow it down to a particular verse. Then we look at the paragraph as a whole, the entire book, all of the author's writings, the New Testament, and then the entire Bible. But also we have the external contextual layers like the geographical background. We know that this is a letter to the Philippians in Philippi. And so we see also the historical and cultural background. So we have to ask ourselves, what's going on in this location where Paul's writing so that we can better understand what these letters would have meant to their original audience. So just want to keep that in mind as anytime we look at any text, but especially something like Philippians 2. All right, and so just briefly looking at this text, we see here, Philippians 2, we know that the context here tells us to be one in Christ, and he's talking about being like-minded, having the same love, being united in spirit and in purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or empty pride, but in humility, consider others more important than yourselves. Says each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interest of others. And so Paul prefaces what he's about to say here with that, and then hops right into it. And then he says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And so we know not only from the beginning of this letter, but also after Paul's done with this, what they call the Philippians hymn, he goes right back to saying again, do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may be blameless and pure. And it's basically about basically not being selfish, but looking out for the interests of others. And so he goes on to say, let this mind be within you that was also in Christ Jesus, who existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. And so some of these terms we're going to want to look at here. And we see, for instance, just really quick, a quote which captures the essence of looking at these Greek words to understand what they mean. We don't want to assume their meaning. We don't want to go to a text with a presupposition about what these words mean. We want to extract out of them using all of the different things available to us, all the linguistic evidence we have, and all the different contextual elements we've listed. And so Nelson Raymond Cape says this, and I don't remember if this was an article or a book he wrote called Philippians 2, 6 through 11, Pre-Existence or Second Adam Christology. He says, whether or not Paul intended for Philippians 2, 6 through 11 to have a pre-existence Christology or a second Adam Christology depends to a large extent on the interpretation of a small number of Greek words contained in the text. Now, I will start by saying that I don't necessarily hold to any of these views, but I do see a second Adam Christology, hints of that, obviously, in this hymn. And there's nothing inherently in this text which demands that we read pre-existence into it. So, Tony, you said you did have some concerns or some things you see in this text, which you thought might, well, I don't know your view. Why don't you share with us your understanding of this text and maybe some problems you see with either interpretation, either way?
Yeah, so I see Philippians 2:6 as in more of an Arian type perspective. If you're familiar with the Arian controversy, the Arian Christology was the second most prominent Christology on trial, so to speak, at the Council of Nicaea, represented by, of course, Bishop Arius. And the idea, of course, with Arius was that Jesus was a lesser but divine being that was created. Obviously, that goes strongly against Trinitarian Christology. And so I take that sort of Christological lens when I approach Paul's epistle to the church in Philippi. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I would prefer as an academic to approach this text that way. Remember where Philippi is in the ancient Mediterranean. I think as you started off, very well stated in your introduction, that it's important to geographically contextualize the area for which we are writing to, or that Paul's writing to in this instance. And he's writing to the church in Philippi. Philippi is in the northeastern part of Greece, so it's well emerged into Greco-Roman area culture, sociology. These people would be very astute, very understanding, very aware of Greek and Roman mythology that encompasses the lands, of course, for which they lived. And so I have to see this text as appealing to them. And in fact, we know that when Paul was establishing the church in Philippi in likely 60 AD, again being ecumenical, there wasn't even a synagogue in this community. I mean, that tells you how foreign, how far away we are from Jerusalem and from Jewish and Hebraic type thinking. So we really have to take ourselves out of the way that we view these texts, the way that we even might think the Jews might view these texts. That's not at all how these texts are going to be received by the people in Philippi. So how then would best, I think, the people in Philippi understand this language, which I think is quite complex, and I'm really interested to hear how you approach it. But the way that I think they would understand this is in a Greco-Roman context. Why? Because in the Greco-Roman context, there's a proliferation of gods that were in competition with one another. For example, the most prominent story in all of Greco-Roman mythology, well, the story is developed in two different ways. In Roman mythology and in Greek mythology, or I should say Greek mythology and Roman mythology, Greek comes first. But in Greek mythology, the son of God, Zeus, goes to war. Well, actually, his father, Kronos, goes to war with him by swallowing his sons. But the Zeus escapes because he is hidden, and Zeus then has to go to war as the son of God with Kronos to become the supreme god of the Greek pantheon. And of course, he does. And that's why we know Zeus to be the supreme god. But he gets there because he took something that did not originally belong to him, and that was kingship over the Greek pantheon. And we see battles like this play out throughout Greek and Roman theology. As I said, in the Roman sense, of course, it is Saturn and Jupiter that play out, with Saturn being the pre-existing, before the supreme god, and then Jupiter, of course, overcoming, ruling, and taking the godship, kingship from Saturn. We see actually very interestingly with Hercules, who I think is most similar to what we're looking at here in Philippians 2:6, is that Hercules is one of the very few figures that's semi-divine, what we would call a demigod. So he has two natures, so to speak, half God, half man. And after his engagement with Hera, who is a god, in his trials and tribulations, upon his death, he is resurrected from the dead and deified into full godship. And I think that that's something like what we're seeing here. And as I stated earlier, and I'm going to conclude here because I know I said a lot. As I stated earlier with the virgin birth, these would be common concepts and motifs that a Greco-Roman audience would be able to immediately identify with. And so what Paul is saying here is he contrasting Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, from these other sons of gods that would have been very familiar to the people in Philippi.
Yeah, I mean, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I guess I never considered that. So technically, Philippi is in Macedonia, I think, and so you could have that element of there, and and this is a good note for everyone, is that sometimes we don't have exactly the answers, but what we can do is we can draw from the different levels of the cultural context available to us. And we can say, well, this might look similar and this might look similar. And we want to consider all of these things, because typically I look at it as much of the Bible is, and you rightly stated that the Greek culture was first. So they were under the rule, I think, of the Persians first, and then the Greeks for several hundred years. And then only near the New Testament times were they under Roman rule. And so technically these provinces would have been under Roman rule. And so we do see those similarities there. For me, so that's an interesting perspective that I haven't really considered. So I don't know that I can answer too much to it right now. Okay. So I do appreciate that. But I will say that how I understand it is this more from a Roman perspective, and when we see the Roman gods and their lords. And so we have, for instance, Nero is Jupiter's earthly representative. And so when we have the imperial cult worship and these temples being set up to the Caesars, for instance, and they're wanting their statues in these temples, and we see, for me, the parallel, it would be contrasting Caesar, Christ with Caesar. So Jesus Christ is Lord in comparison with the Roman emperors such as Nero or even Caesar. But so within this passage, would you first agree that there's nothing in this text which demands that it be read to prove pre-existence? Like, there's nothing in this text which demands that you read it from a pre-existence perspective.
So I think the way that we would approach this, I don't think pre-existence, when you say that term, we kind of have to define that. I don't think that anything in this text expresses pre-existence in a Trinitarian sense, which is, of course, the main argument in the Council of Nicaea in terms of the nature of Jesus. So I don't think you find anything like that here. But if you're simply asking, is this arguing that Jesus, in some sense, in the form of God, existed before his human birth? I do think that's a credible argument.
Yeah, we could use the Arian perspective, which I think would be which more compatible with this is because just in this first sentence, when we read, or first verse in Philippians 2:6, who existing in the form of God, and we see that word morphe here,
Okay.
understanding that, well, God doesn't have a form. And especially according to New Testament authors, they would say that no one has ever seen God at any time. And so typically the Arian perspective is, and even some Trinitarians, they just contradict. It's a self-contradicting argument when they say, well, no one has ever seen God. So who is it that they saw? They saw Christ, but then they say, well, Christ was God. Right? No one has ever seen God, but people saw Christ, but somehow Christ is still God. So it's just a contradiction of identity. I guess I would ask first, let's consider that line of thinking there with Zeus and his father. You said, what was his father's name in the mythology?
If you're a big fan of God of War, that video game series, then you'll be familiar with that.
No, my son loves that game, and I started playing with it, and I was like, yeah, that's a good father-son game right there for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
And so let's assume that is what they have in mind here. How then do you read this text, and what are you extracting from this text? Like, what would the parallel be there? We'll start just with verse 6.
Yeah, well, I think with 5, it's important to know who we're talking about. It says, let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus. Who? So the who here is Jesus, you would say. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. So then the second clause there, because notice this is one complete sentence or idea, verses 5 through 7 there. And this is the next part of the clause. So Christ Jesus is the subject who here is existing in the form of God. Now, I know that you've already had a very different interpretation of the divine conception, the virgin birth, what all that means. John's incipit. But I think the understanding here is that before Jesus in the flesh, he existed in a divine state. And when I say divine state, I mean in a sense that any of the gods in the Greco-Roman pantheon are considered God or fully God, but obviously that doesn't mean that they are related to each other in some type of, Trinitarian relationship. That just means that the nature of them are fully divine, as opposed to someone like Hercules, who is half divine, half human, or someone like Caesar, as you denoted, who becomes deified after death.
Yeah, so I guess, so again, going back here to this, what Raymond Cape says here, he says that whatever position, whatever view we have is going to, depends on, to a large extent, on the interpretation of a small number of Greek words. Mm-hmm. And so I guess it's important to look first at the words that we see here. And so we could say, well, this word form here, this word morphe, of course, let's see here, would generally refer to something which strikes the vision. And which is also like the word icon, in the word, in the phrase image of God, typically it is something that you see. But so I guess, how would you understand this word here, morphe?
Well, I think you can, and certainly Paul would have been very aware of Genesis when God creates man in his image. And so I think you can relate morphe form here to image. But here, I think existing in that form of God is talking specifically about a point in which he is in a divine state as opposed to a human state. And the reason why I say that is because when we get into the question about equality, I don't think it makes any sense to say that Jesus in some human form sought equality with God. Am I straw manning perhaps your argument there?
No, not really, because I haven't really, I did do a 30-minute video on this topic. So I don't know if you've seen the video yet. Have you seen the video?
I did not see that particular one.
Okay, no problem. So, I mean, no, you're not straw manning. You don't know yet. I haven't presented anything. And there's only kind of so many options that float around within scholarship. So, no, you're fine there.
So I don't think it makes sense to say, so I'm rebuffing both, I think, perhaps a Unitarian view and also a Trinitarian view when we get to the next clause in my argument. So I do think Paul is arguing that Jesus pre-existed his human flesh, his human body, his human form in the form of, and I would use a definite article that's not here in the Greek, which is interesting because Christians get on to me when it comes to the angel of the Lord. They're very okay with inserting indefinite articles a or the whenever they want. But here I think actually it would be appropriate to insert the indefinite article a to say that that who was existing was in the form of a God. Did not consider equality with the God something to be grasped. I think that that's the more an appropriate reading or understanding how someone might approach this text. And so who is the God? Well, again, going back to the Greco-Roman setup, which would have been instantly familiar, instantly recognizable to this audience. So think about Zeus and his father, Kronos. So in this case, it would be Zeus existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with his father, Kronos, something to be grasped. Obviously, of course, in that mythology is the opposite. Zeus does consider it. Jesus here doesn't. And instead of going up, Jesus goes down, right? He empties himself out, which Trinitarians, in a sense, and Arians, where I represent, would say, or at least in terms of how I'm approaching this text, would say this is where Jesus in some fashion diminished his equality or his godship, that he kind of almost does the reverse of Hercules, right? That Hercules is this half man, half God who gets powered up to full godship, whereas Jesus empties himself out to the state of flesh and bone and blood, this man who's an incredible and extraordinary man, right? Even Paul, of course, acknowledges that, but nonetheless, he's completely out of the fullness of Godship when he takes on his humanity and becomes a servant in that way. So I'll stop there because we can keep on going through this, and there's a lot in this text.
Well, so the first thing that comes to mind is that, well, if we were to accept this line of thinking as if, well, this is what inspired Paul to write for whatever reason, perhaps he's just comparing the stories or using the story, mimetically, I guess you could say. Well, for me is that it seems that would completely remove this text from a Jewish perspective. And Paul is obviously,
And that's why I led with the geographical note that in some of the places that Paul's writing to, there are already established synagogues in the diaspora. This area in the church in Philippi has no synagogue. So that shows that there is essentially no Jewish presence of note in the area. And so the way that, and Paul actually tells us in the book of Corinthians that there's a certain approach to his proselytizing. He talks to people as they are. And in Philippi, why would he speak in a way that in which these people probably have no idea substantively about the biblical text in the Hebrew canon? That's far removed to them. So if Paul's going to win these people over, if he's going to speak to them in a way that they understand, remember, these people are not Jews who become Christians in the church of Philippi. These are recently pagans, people who literally believed in Zeus, people who literally believed in Romulus, people who literally believed in Hercules before they became Christians. Okay? That's the sort of audience that we're talking to here. So just like you might know Superman and Spider-Man, we don't believe that there's actually a 18 to 25-year-old boy named Peter Parker swinging webs around lower Manhattan. But in fact, these people actually did believe in Hercules, okay, and Perseus and what have you. And so for Paul, he needs to communicate to this church in a way, speaking in a language in which they understand about how they should understand Jesus. Okay.
Yeah, so, well, I think everyone should really take note. I think that's a good point that you're making is in what we want to ask ourselves is who was Paul speaking to? And this is one of the elements that we want to look at within the context of which this letter was written to get into the mind of what Paul intended his audience to hear and who his audience originally was. I think that it does assume that perhaps there wasn't a synagogue there. That makes sense. But it also would assume that there's no Jewish people there at all, right? And so I don't think it's demonstrably true to say that there was no Jewish people in Philippi.
No, I don't think that's true at all. I think that there probably were a scattered few people. I mean, even here in Winston-Salem, I'm always shocked how many more Jews there are than what I thought. But the lack of the synagogue just shows that there's no vibrant or demonstrable Jewish presence in the area. So are there a couple of scattered Jewish families? Perhaps. But remember, Paul sees himself as what? The apostle to the Gentiles. So he understands in large part that, particularly as he goes around the ancient Mediterranean, whether it be to the church in Colossae or in Corinth or in Ephesus or what we're talking about here in Philippi, that he's going to be speaking to increasingly a Gentile audience that's not at all going to be familiar with the motifs in the Hebrew Bible. But I do think he also conceptually inserts those motifs here because, after all, the claim is that Jesus is the Christ of the Hebrew Bible, of the scriptures. So while he's using imagery and concepts that would be familiar to his audience, he's doing that in such a way to graft them in to the Jewish Messiah in his view.
Right, which would ultimately be his perspective. He's going to bring them into the Jewish perspective. Not just present them this gospel, which is foreign to its roots, right?
Right, absolutely. And I think as we even progress here in Philippians 2:6 in the Carmen Christi hymn, we're going to start to see some Jewish themes infiltrate that differentiate. Well, first of all, this is the Jewish theme, right? So in the Greco-Roman theme, your son of gods took it upon themselves to grasp what did not belong to them. In our view of Son of God, or in Paul's, what I think is immersion, we were talking about Philo of Alexandria before. So in my view, Paul's Hellenistic Judaism, what we see is that his view of Son of God, the Son of God doesn't grasp things that don't belong to him. And in fact, he goes the opposite way. He takes on the sort of motif we see in Isaiah 53 of the suffering servant, right? He becomes a servant, emptying himself out and even to the point of death on the cross.
Right. So within this, so getting back to form of God, I think that I want to share this really quick. I want to share this excerpt from the Word Biblical Commentary on Philippians. And it talks about this word, and because typically this word does mean something that strikes the appearance. And so you would see it somehow. It refers to something you would look at. But they say this. This is volume 43, page 110. It says, form, based on its Greek usage in Greek literature, refers primarily to that which may be perceived by the senses. Yet, when this word is applied to God, as here, such an understanding is quite inadequate, for God is invisible and has not been and cannot be comprehended by the human senses. Furthermore, when the hymn says that Christ took on the form of a slave after his kenosis, it is not likely that its author had in mind that Christ merely looked like or had the external appearance of a slave. Thus, these two expressions, in the form of God and form of a slave, together demand a new and fresh meaning for form. And so typically we would see this word referring to something you would see, but it doesn't quite make sense. Now, it is interesting if you take the perspective that there's an indefiniteness there in God. And so if you said that he's in the form of a God, that's that is one thing that commentators do bring up, the indefiniteness there. I would say that now I can't remember. So do you have the perspective that it is the form of the God, or is it would you say do you see it as a form of a God?
So so that first in the form of a God, and did not seek equality. When I was inserting these articles, I used a as in the form of a God, and then at the second theos, I'm inserting the article the God to differentiate between the godships of Jesus and the godships of God the Father. So in that first clause in verse 6, in the form of a God, I'm inserting the article a there. Did not consider equality with the God something to be grasped. Because in my interpretation, I want my audience to understand that Jesus is a God, and that's being differentiated from God the Father, who is the God in the second part of that clause in verse 6.
Yeah, I just don't see that as the most probable reading. I think it's possible because of, again, the indefiniteness there. I think even in the Greek, but when we see God throughout this whole text, form of God, equality with God, therefore God exalted him. That subject always just seems to be the Father alone. But something he did bring up again here in this, something else commentators point out is that if we have the form of God and then form of a slave, these two would be directly antithetical. And so what it means in one place, it would mean in the other place. And so, and one thing I think they correctly note here, or interestingly note, let's say for the sake of conversation, it is not likely that its author had in mind that Christ merely looked like or had the external appearance. And so my line of reasoning there is, well, when we see, if these are directly antithetical, then if in, in verse 7, if it says form of a servant, and that doesn't mean anything about what he looked like. Like, for instance, when you looked at Christ, there's nothing where you can physically identify him as a servant, right? You don't look at Christ and say automatically because of the way he looks that he's a servant, right? And so the same would.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I think the same would apply there for form of God. If these two mean the same thing, if they're directly antithetical, then what form it means here in verse 7, it must mean in verse 6. And if it doesn't refer to something that you look like in verse 7, then it has to, then it can't be what you look like in verse 6, which then puts the burden back on you now to explain how you would understand form of God there. What does that word form mean? Or are you saying that it's just altogether removed from the Jewish context for Paul? Because it seems to be, if you take that interpretation, that it's altogether removed from the Hebrew Bible. And I don't think that that's correct.
So I think here, and I agree with some of your concerns here, and that's why I'm a Jew and not a Christian, right? Because I do see in the nature of these gospels that they're getting very far away from Hebraic teaching. But yes, nonetheless, that's what I think is presented here. So when we're talking about form of servant or slave, it tells us literally what that means. So it is being made in human likeness. So in this, remember, for the ancient world, Godship exists, or was talk about independent consciousness for certain beings exists on a spectrum. So you have the supreme God in one corner who represents Zeus. Then you have gods that are fully God, fully divine, like Athena, like Poseidon. You talked about the word hermeneutics, or Hermes, who's a Greco-Roman god who actually is in a contest with Apollo, right? These are fully gods. And then you have people who, again, are like Perseus and Hercules, who are demigods. And then you have people who are humans who are lucky enough to become gods. And then you have the lowest level in the strata, okay? And what's the lowest level in the strata? Poetically, the slave, the servant. And what is that? The human who has no powers, no divinity, nothing special. Okay. And so that's what servant means here, is that it's contrasting, like a god is a king, right? Is essentially a king in comparison to a human. God is a king, a human is a slave or a servant. And that's what's being said here, that when Jesus took on human flesh, he became like the slaves. He became like the servants. He's no longer in that God class anymore. And this, of course, enables him to die, right? Because gods can't die, at least gods that are not fully divine, depending on how you approach them. And so taking on this, it allows him to die in a sense, because as we keep on going through Philippians 2:6, gods are immortal, right? So he doesn't really die, but this wounding, this suffering, it transforms him, because it shows obedience to God, which gives him greater glory.
Yeah. So again, and I truly appreciate this, because as a researcher, I want to know all of the different angles which someone could take to understand the text, and they're very important. And what you say is, whether I agree ultimately that's what Paul was trying to do or not, it's still very important to understand what this would have meant to these people. Right? Perhaps they weren't so familiar with Judaism. That's perhaps they weren't. And I would agree that a lot of these people were steeped in these other religions, Greek religions and Roman religions, and we have to understand that. Or even the New Testament itself makes no sense. Like, if they're calling Christ Lord, as we have to ask ourselves, well, as opposed to who being the Lord, right? And so that would be the Roman emperors. And so there's a sort of subversion of the Roman imperial cults and things like that's taking place within the whole New Testament narrative. But again, one of the problems that I see is that it seems, again, that it's just completely removing this from its Hebrew roots. And for me, I see all of these elements within the Hebrew Bible. To me, it depends on how you understand it, because I think a lot of times we've been presented this text already with people's presuppositional, interpretations in mind. And so it's not like as if we're discovering this for the first time. This text.
Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Chadesh Yameh Amen.